Hello, class. My name is Andrew Mallory, and today I will be discussing Charles Dickens and his influence on the Victorian era. So, the introduction, the Victorian era itself was an era of revolutions economic, with its factories, technological, with their railroads. But what's interesting is that social and political reforms were the byproduct of the two aforementioned. Really, we see workers advocate for change, and we also see them advocate for political reform not only in the workplace at the factory, but we see these things really progress because of the outdated political census in England. So not only did they want more fair representation based on voting people of themselves, but they also wanted the census to be changed. And Charles Dickens's Great Expectations helped really get more middle class workers into the government and allowed for more voting reform, which was fantastic. So the main idea is that Charles Dickens's literary elements in Great Expectations would ultimately advocate for reform and successfully do it, which is extremely monumentous. And there's three main components that support this thesis. First and foremost, its influence on society. So, Great Expectations alone is an icon, especially at the time, because it allowed people to relate with English society, the very society they lived in. It allowed them to read it almost as if it was real, even though they were fictional characters. So, they're thinking and they're observing these characters and they're like, wow, that really seems like my own society. And then second, accessibility of reading. At this time, public schooling was being furthered in England. Not only that, but we also see that the short stories are being published in newspapers and they can further their literary skills by expanding their vocabulary and it allows them to read these tough books. So, second are its iconic characters. What's amazing about this book is that the characters make the book. The book is not its own entity, it is propped up, it is entirely encased in the characters. Basically, the strong, iconic personalities that are in this book allow you to observe every minute detail because you're just so focused on these characters. For example, Pip and his lusts for being rich actually allows us to understand more where he's coming from, but allows us also to understand the beginning of his downfall and how lust is not really good. And then we also have Estella here in the middle, who's coming from prominence, but she's very snooty and uppity, and she condescends Pip. And we're able to see that, and we're able to pay attention to every little thing she says to him because of her strong, prominent character that's really just kind of disgusting and evil, much like Miss Havisham's, except she has a backstory and there's a reason as to why this is all being propped up, and it just makes you extremely excited because you're reading the book and you understand that each character has a different component that makes them unique and special. So you listen to what they have to say because they are special in their own right. And then lastly, the Romantic continuation. The Victorian era is a continuation of the Romantic era. And I'd really like to cite two specific examples that I have in the presentation. First of all, you have the Reform of 1832. It's a voting reform in the Romantic era that allowed males to vote who owned property. Okay, well, Charles Dickens writes Great Expectations in 1861. And then in 1867, we have an extended voting reform based on that, where it does not require as much property to be able to vote, which is extremely crucial because it's closer to complete liberty by voting, of course. So we see Charles Dickens influence society in the latter 1800s because of his piece, which is extremely awesome. We don't commonly see that. So when we see him do this, we see a different society basically being made as we observe the history. So, to wrap it up, the text's significance. Overall, how is this all significant to me? Well, it allows me to become more historically informed. So, when I observe other historical accounts, I can understand that social reform is crucial in history and that it's necessary for an effective society in terms of working and political governing. How it affects the current events it allows me to understand that nowadays we actually still see oppressed social groups and how that's extremely important to advocate for them and to give them rights, because society is ultimately a society of bigotry and feudal inheritance. If we don't exactly correct the ways of the past that were wrong, we're more like feudalists than we are civilized peoples who understand one another. We're outdated. And that's extremely important to understand. And lastly, the literary canon. At the time, the literary canon, and still is that we need to advocate for people who do not have rights. Unfortunately, in any social structure, there's always going to be an oppressed people. For example, African Americans, who make up 11% of the population but commit like 60% of the crimes, unfortunately, they're all grouped in with those people, which is extremely unfortunate. And it's wrong. And it's important that we advocate for their rights and make sure that they have just as much rights as everybody else. We need to make sure that they also have some sort of voice. And we need to advocate that there are good people in every group and bad people in every group. It's extremely important that society does not convict people based on everybody else in that certain ethnicity or that certain social class. It's important that we all work together. And that's really what I take out of it entirely. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a good day. Cheers!